Number 1. The Shed. I'm going to start this story by telling you that some people may find it a little bit disturbing. It's not so much the events in the story as to what I saw, and what I was afraid of, that make the story scary. It has everything to do with the actions of the other people in the story that might create a problem. First, I am much older, and this happened a very long time ago. Although I would like to think the attitudes of people are different now than they were back then, I know that people like my father still exist. However, back when I was a child, they were more common and were not looked on with the kind of derision that they are today. I was a small, bookish sort when I was in school. I wasn't interested in sports or anything like that. I didn't enjoy going hunting or going fishing. I wasn't even interested in learning to drive a car, to tell you the truth. I was happy if I could just be in my bedroom with a book. Well, my dad didn't like that. My older brother was very much the sporting type. He would help my dad work on cars. He played football. He did all the things that my father assumed that boys were supposed to do. And by comparison, he really didn't like the things that I did. In fact, he would often mock me over my interests. Hell, there were times when the man forced me into activities that I absolutely showed no interest in. He even forced me into some activities that scared the hell out of me. For example, I remember being 8 years old. He wanted to teach me to shoot his father's shotgun. You know, asking an 8-year-old to shoot a gun or rifle is bad enough. He wanted to teach me to shoot a shotgun. I expressed absolutely no interest in doing this at all. He literally forced me to do it. I remember crying as he made me hold the gun and told me to be a man. Yes, of course, because not only should an 8-year-old act like a man, apparently shooting a shotgun is what would make me a man. I cried throughout the entire experience, and when I did shoot the gun, the kick knocked me onto my butt. My shoulder was deeply bruised. This was sort of par for the course with me and my dad. He wanted to create these bonding moments that he had with his own father, but he went about it all in the wrong way. Rather than find things that we had in common, I was forced to go on fishing trips, hunting trips, work on cars, just things that I had no desire to do. But it was all because he thought it would teach me how to be a man. Men were supposed to be rugged, brave, and all that other BS. When I refused to take interest in those things, he would force me to, and he would also mock me. He would imply that I was going to grow up and be gay or something like that, which we know is stupid and completely absurd. The worst thing he ever did to me was when I was 11 years old. We lived in a house way out in the country. It was in a hollow, and there weren't really lights around. It was dark and pretty scary all the time. Set back in the hollow was an old wooden shed that we never did much with. I didn't like it because it had spiders and cobwebs in it. Well, what I remember was watching the news one night. Well, I was actually reading while my family watched the news. But I overheard that there was a prison escape in our immediate area. The man who had escaped was a convicted murderer, and was possibly armed, and definitely dangerous. Well, I was immediately terrified, and I told my dad that we should make sure all the doors are locked and the windows too. He refused and simply set a shotgun by the door. If anyone showed up, we'd just have to kill him. Even at 11, I realized how stupid this was. I was really afraid. When I kept begging my dad to check all the windows, he got really pissed at me. He grabbed me by the wrist and dragged me out through the kitchen and out the back door. I didn't know what his intent was, but he was yelling at me for being scared. He took me out to the shed. He threw me in it and padlocked the door. He told me he was going to make a man out of me yet. And he went back into the house and turned the back porch light out. This was decades and decades ago, but I can still feel the very same fear that I felt on that night. I can remember how pitch black everything was. I can remember thinking I was going to die that night. All I did was curl up in a ball against the corner and tried to be as quiet as possible. Maybe about an hour after I had been out there, I heard a shotgun shot. and that was followed by a hideous scream. Then there were 2 more shots. I was trying to be quiet, but tears were rolling down my cheeks. At that moment, I knew that the convict had come to my house and murdered my family. Trying to remain as quiet as possible, I became acutely aware of every noise around me, and it wasn't long before I heard the crackling sounds of a man walking on leaves. It was coming from the direction of our house, and it was coming towards me. I did everything I could to not cry, but I couldn't keep from crying. I was so terrified. I heard someone stop outside the shed, right in front of the door, and then there was a tapping sound on the door. I heard someone fiddling with the padlock. Not knowing what else to do, I grabbed a pitchfork that was in the shed. I figured if I stabbed the murderer right away when he opened the door, I could run off. I braced myself, and I heard the lock come off, and the door began to open. Without thinking, I stabbed the intruder right in the leg, causing him to yell and drop his gun. However, before I could run off, I noticed that it was my dad that got stabbed. I found out later that the convict was never there. My father had shot the shotgun, screamed, and pretended he was the murderer to scare me. He had put an 11-year-old in a position where he thought he was going to die and had to defend himself the only way that he could. And so I did. And the worst part about it all is that I did exactly what he wanted me to do. But I still got in trouble for it. When the police showed up after the ambulance did, I explained everything that happened to the police. I was taken that day to my aunt's house to stay for a while. My dad didn't go to jail for anything. This was a long time ago, way out in the country, but at least I wasn't with him for a long time. I remained with my aunt for a year. At the end of that year, my mom divorced my dad and I went to live with her. The old man is still alive. However, he has never once tried to make amends with me. That night was truly the last interaction I ever had with him, and to tell you the truth, I'm still happy about that. You don't have to be a murderer to be a monster. Number 2. Home by myself. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I believe I was 14 at the time. My family had recently moved into a house on a rural route. It was a beautiful area on top of a hill. It was surrounded with other hills and forests. Our yard was huge. The house was right on top of the hill, and when you went outside you could see miles and miles of beautiful countryside. It's weird to remember this, as it happened in the 1980s. We lived in a nice brick ranch with 3 bedrooms. It was beautiful, but for some reason I recall the rent only being $300. I mean, I guess I was a teenager and don't really understand inflation, but hell, the house was so nice, I would imagine it being in the thousands if someone were to rent it today. I really only bring that up because it's important to know the state of my family's expenses at the time. My stepmother did not work. There were 3 kids, and my dad was on disability. He got 2 disability checks, which, when added together, would have been less than $700. And 5 people were supposed to live on that. So we didn't have things like cable, but that was fine. I actually had no problem watching fuzzy television. Even now they have a nostalgic quality for me. But more often than not, we did not have phone service either. And that's pretty important for this story. My older brother was at an aunt's house for the summer. The rest of my family wanted to visit my stepmother's family. I never liked them, so I ended up staying home. They'd be gone a few days, and I was okay with that. I was watching Tales from the Dark Side. In the dark. So it must have been around 1 in the morning. And that is when I noticed something a bit odd. It looked like there was a small light coming up the driveway. I only caught it for a few moments, but it was enough to know it was not a lightning bug. That made me curious enough that I turned the television off, so I could see better. There was enough of a moon that night that I was finally able to notice someone walking up to the door. I didn't recognize him, and I got a little concerned. Before he could notice me doing it, I closed the drapes of the big picture window. I peeked out, and I watched the man walk up to the porch. He went to the door, and I heard him trying to move the doorknob. He didn't bother knocking, he was just trying to let himself in. Fortunately, I had locked the door, so that wasn't an issue. After pushing himself up against the door a few times, he walked off the porch. He looked around a bit, and I saw him begin to walk around to the back of the house. I heard him go to the back door, which was the door of the kitchen, and try to open it as well. He also failed at this. But he was obviously trying to get into the house, and it probably wouldn't be long before he decided to try and break a window. I ran to my dad's room and grabbed his rifle out of the closet. As I did, the man went back to the front porch, and he was trying to see in the house from the picture window. Scared to death, but our phone service was down, so I couldn't call the police or anything. I did the only thing I could to try and keep him from breaking the window. I turned the porch light on and opened the drapes to show him I had the gun. He was startled at first, but he didn't move to leave. He just stared at me for a few moments, and then smiled at me. It was freaky. He took out a cigarette, lit it, and then casually walked off the porch, giving me a little wave as he walked back down the driveway. I didn't sleep at all that night, and I kept the rifle by me. I was completely terrified, too. I kept thinking he would come back, but he didn't. And again, I had no way to contact my parents or the police. I was pretty terrified until my parents came home, and even after that, I wasn't at ease. Number 3. Cabin. This isn't a long story, but it is the scariest thing I can think that has ever happened to me. When I was younger, we used to go and visit my grandmother. At the time, she lived in a cabin out in the woods. She was involved with a man who had always lived a very rural existence. I mean, he hunted his own food and everything. I do remember liking him and thinking that his house was neat. I recall one fall when we were there. There was a very small back room that was almost more than the size of a closet. It had a twin bed in it that was generously covered in quilts. This was good because it got very cold at night. It had one window which was right above the foot of the bed. When I went to sleep in that room, I have to admit to finding it a little creepy. I was very used to having a room in a big house, in a suburban neighborhood with a lot of lighting. I didn't really have any light when I went into the room, not even a lamp or anything. It was very dark, and even though my eyes got adjusted to the dark, it was still very, very dark in that room. Despite being creeped out, it was not very long before I fell asleep. The things that normally scared me were closets and under-the-bed type of stories. Fortunately, there was no room in that tiny room for either of those things to be there. I guess it got so cold that at some point while I was sleeping, I pulled the quilts over my head, so I was laying in bed with the covers over my head. I assumed that the reason I had woke up was because of the cold, but it was then that I heard a tapping sound. I mean, it wasn't a light tap, but it wasn't a knock either. It sounded like a tap on the window above the bed. I guess I was a bit scared when I first heard the noise. I mean, it was creepy enough being in a cabin in the middle of nowhere and in a small room all by myself. But to hear something tapping on the window, that was even freakier. And the tapping continued for a while, and I did my best to just ignore it. But as it went on and on, I had to admit to becoming more curious about it. After a bit of time, I decided I needed to peek out under the cover and see what was going on. I knew I would probably feel silly if I looked out and it was just a branch, but that really is what I was expecting. I peeked out and over at the window. I saw a hand reaching up from under the window, tapping on the window over and over again. I had no idea who it could have been, because only the hand was showing, and it kept tapping 2 fingers against the window over and over. I didn't really know what to do. I didn't call out to anyone. I just pulled the quilts back over my head. I lay there, shivering from fear and the cold, while the tapping continued for who knows how long. I mentioned it in the morning, but my parents wrote it off as me having a bad dream. There wasn't another house or cabin anywhere within walking distance, so they dismissed the fact that anyone could have been outside. But I know what I saw, and not knowing who or why it was happening was deeply terrifying. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. Dracula update. I got the lines recorded that need to be recorded, and Dracula will be my next video after this one. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this with somebody you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story that you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.